Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to my Unit 2 presentation. Today we're going to discuss if the world's relationship with globalism is changing, and if it is, whether we're seeing a rise or regression in it. Here's our agenda. I'll start with a quick introduction, then I'll talk about what this enigma we call globalization is all about. We'll define it, then look at different aspects of it, and by logical extension, we'll examine what post-globalization is. Then we'll compare the indicators we would see for a world that is on the path to continued globalization or on the path to post-globalization. Finally, we'll look at one, maybe two events from recent news headlines. We'll apply our globalization filter, if you will, and see what aspects will pop out at us as road signs or signposts to a world on the path to continued globalization or on a path to post-globalization. So I've picked out only a few events from headlines among what's possibly a nearly infinite number. I'd ask that when you are posting your thoughts in the weekly forum, you also add events that you see in the headlines and say why you think that it points one way or the other to a trend of continued globalization, maybe a trend of plateaued globalization, or post-globalization, with of course the underpinning evidence. You'll also note that I've included the references of the articles I've used to draw information from at the bottom right-hand corner of each slide. All the information should be considered as taken from these references, and I only present to you my own thoughts at the end of the presentation. Most of you probably had the same International Relations and Contemporary War Module 1 that I did, so I'll make my introduction pretty brief. My name is still Stephen Johnson. I'm a U.S. Naval Aviator, and I've been in the service for just under 26 years. My family and I are stationed in the United Kingdom, living just outside of London in a town called Gerrards Cross. I currently work at NATO's Maritime Component Command in Northwood, England. Very interesting job, especially right now. As you can imagine, we are very, very busy these days. As Cohen and Nye stated, globalization implies an increase in something, or there's more of it. Therefore, to understand globalization, we must first know what globalism is. Globalism is a world interconnected over transcontinental distances, and this interconnectedness takes shape as networked flows and influences of capital and goods, information and ideals, people and forces, and globally common problems such as climate change and pandemics. This is just another fancy way of saying the widening, deepening, and acceleration of worldwide connectedness. It captures the total forces which affect the international system: political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure. Of note, globalism does not mean universality. In fact, one of the major criticisms of globalism is that it is accompanied by an increase in the gap between the rich and the poor. Hoffman states that globalism can take three forms: economic, cultural, and political. Economic globalization is born from the revolutions in technology and trade. It includes surges in foreign investment and international business. Its main actors are transnational companies, banks, investors, and private service industries, as well as state and international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF. Of all the benefits of globalization, economic globalization does not favor or support social justice, or by extension, global peace, and leads to inequality among states. Next, we have cultural globalization. While you could argue that cultural globalization has been around since maybe the Silk Road, the recent acceleration of globalization in the 1990s is a product of the technical innovation in economic globalization. Together, these two things facilitate the flow of cultural goods, or the free flow of ideas and culture. However, the free flow of ideas and culture also brings on the possibility of tensions between uniformity and diversity. and it can also lead to a backlash against Western liberal ideals and nationalist tendencies. Finally, political globalization could be characterized by the U.S. pursuit of hegemony, Western liberal ideals, and the rise in density of NGOs and IGOs. A major debate within political globalization concerns the importance of the state on the world stage and whether global governance will challenge its status as the primary actor anytime soon. Many IGOs are without democratic accountability and could be characterized as weak, meaning they have no real teeth to enforce the regulations they're responsible for. So now that we know globalization is sort of an expansion of the condition of globalism, we can, by logical extension, argue that post-globalization is the contraction of globalism. In short, it would be characterized by a reduction or severing of the ties that make the world economies network together, decreases in flow of goods and financial services, and the nationalization of supply chains. So now let's move on to the next section to get an understanding of the indicators we might see as contemporary globalism expands or contracts. To answer the question, are we post-globalization, we must look for indications and warnings that point to which way the world is heading. A state that is moving towards a globally integrated economy will see economic policies which favor integration, such as low tariffs on imports, entering into free and fair trade agreements with its close neighbors and trading partners around the world. These states will encourage unimpeded movement of the labor force and remove any other barriers to the flow of international trade and finance. A state which encourages the free flow of ideas and cultures also trends towards cultural globalization. They have and encourage a diverse and multi-ethnic population. For political globalization to become a reality, we would need to see state leadership push globalist and internationalist agendas within their own domestic affairs. We would also see a rise in the power and density of intergovernmental organizations. This would have an accompanying decline in the power and sovereignty of the state on the world stage, as states give up some measure of autonomy and authority to IGOs. Through these IGOs, one would see an increase in state cooperation towards solving global problems, such as climate change, poverty, and global health issues. We would also see a continuation of the unipolar world. The opposite of these behaviors holds true when we trend towards a post-globalization world. We would see the withdrawal of states from full integration in the global free markets. You would see state leaders adopt protectionist policies like high tariffs on imports, withdrawals from free trade agreements, or perhaps treaty and agreement manipulations to fit a more protectionist stance. You would perhaps see strict limitations on the movement of people and the labor forces. Counter to cultural globalization, we might see restrictions placed on the free flow of ideas and culture. You might see state resistance to acceptance of other cultures within their borders, or perhaps a pushback against Western liberal values. Trends towards post-political globalization would see a rise in nationalist views among the populations and state leadership and their policies. States on a post-globalization trend might block requests to cede state sovereignty to IGOs, or perhaps withdrawals from IGOs previously signed onto. Hand in glove with these would be a lack of cooperation towards solving global problems. Lastly, you might see a shift towards a multipolar world with different states separating themselves into different camps. Now, of course, this list is not all-inclusive, and it's really just a 10,000-foot view of what globalization is about. Okay, next what I want to do is look at the Ukrainian crisis through the lens of globalization. I want to see what aspects of globalization, or post-globalization for that matter, are factors in the origins, the current state of play, and of course possible solutions to the ongoing crisis. So if we briefly look at the origins of the crisis, we see Central and Eastern Europe falling away from the Russian sphere of influence, and an upset in the balance of power as several former Soviet client states joined NATO. This is a return of power politics. So what I want to do is I'm going to put a little check mark here to help us keep track of what's going on. Now, IGOs have played a somewhat constructive part in the crisis, at least within the context of the diplomatic effort. However, the granddaddy of them all, the United Nations, has shown very little leadership in this issue, at least until the 28th of January, when President Biden requested the United Nations Security Council put this on their agenda, and of course they agreed. This shows very much how weak the United Nations can be. However, regional organizations like NATO and the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe have held talks with Russia, and while they don't have the teeth per se to put an end to the crisis, it does show a level of commitment and solidarity and security interconnectedness among the Western states. So we're going to put a little check mark here next to internationalist tendencies to help us keep score. So the economic aspects of globalization really come into the conversation when we look at what might happen if Europe and the United States place sanctions on Russia. Germany is going to be very concerned about Russian reactions that may see the flow of energy supplies from Russia cut off. This, of course, will be a major loss of revenue for Russia, for President Putin, and of course his cronies. President Putin will be very keen to keep them happy to help ensure the security of his regime. So what I want to do here is to indicate that our integrated global economy presents quite the dilemma when it comes to interstate conflict. So we're going to put a check mark here next to integrated global free markets and then trade agreements. All right, but the opposite side of that coin is that President Putin may not even care, right? He's a nationalist, and Russians tend to have a very nationalist view of things. Think World War II and the Eastern Front, right? They have shown a tremendous capability to endure hardships when needed for the sake of Mother Russia. So let's put a check mark here next to nationalist tendencies. All right, Europe and the United States have also threatened to go with the quote-unquote nuclear economic option. That is, cutting Russia off from the SWIFT banking system. Although they backed off on this rhetoric in the past few days because the possible fallout, pun intended, that could severely affect Europe. So we're going to put up another benchmark for trade agreements. We can also see how advances in technology, one of the major catalysts for the acceleration of globalization in the 1990s, enable near instantaneous forms for diplomatic efforts. We'll put a check mark under free flow of ideas because this represents a capability available to most of us. Quick and easy mass communication. Maybe just not to the same level of encrypted communications that the president has. We also see a sophisticated logistics chain that could rapidly provide military aid to the Ukrainians. Although in this instance, it might be better to characterize it as a technological advancement in transportation. Regardless, we can put a check mark here to represent barriers to international trade. Finally, we see new methods of warfare that take advantage of the technological advancements we mentioned earlier. Cyber attacks have been registered against the Ukrainian government websites as well as Belarusian rail control systems. So again, check marks here and here. For the second headline, or case study if you will, I want to take a quick look at the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's see what role globalization played in its spread, approaches towards stopping it, and how different aspects of globalization allow us to carry on with our lives. From the outset of the pandemic, IGOs have played a significant role in the global response. The World Health Organization, of course, played key roles from the initial reporting of the disease to coordinating responses, sharing information towards developing a vaccine, and calling for equitable access to COVID-19 technologies between states, among other things. Regional IGOs have played a role, of course. For instance, at the onset of the pandemic, the European Union mobilized and coordinated the delivery of protective equipment. They enabled free movement of critical workers and developed strategies to accelerate the production of vaccines and their distribution. Their efforts show a level of cooperation between states to solve global problems that are beyond the capacity of one state to solve. So we're going to put a check mark here for globalist tendencies, the rise of IGOs, and cooperation towards solving global problems to help us keep track of where we're going. Now, one can argue that because of the integration of state economies, which is a central element of globalization, there's been more widespread economic damage caused by COVID-19 than there would have been otherwise in a less integrated economic system. For instance, every advanced economy in the world, as of September 2020, had been hit by a recession or a depression. The long logistical chains common to many companies have been disrupted because of the delays in manufacturing and assembly, movement of supplies, and movement of people. One interesting second-order effect of the pandemic has been the shift from an office culture to a work-from-home culture, at least in the short term. This shift has allowed many companies to function during the pandemic. The ease of travel aspect of globalization may have enabled the rapid spread of the virus, but the tech revolution that accelerated globalization has also helped to reduce some of the economic impacts. The platforms for free flow of information and ideas, such a critical aspect of globalization, have also been instrumental in the spread of misinformation about the pandemic and the vaccines. This, of course, has had a significant impact on people's willingness to accept the vaccine and perhaps put an end to the pandemic. And finally, while globalization has played a role in the pandemic, we also see that the pandemic has played a role in post-globalization. State leaders have adopted nationalist trends over the last 2 years. In fairness, some have been out of necessity. Most countries have put in place some type of restrictions on who can enter the country and who cannot, whether it's vaccinated or unvaccinated. President Donald Trump removed U.S. participation from the World Health Organization. And additionally, many countries have taken on an us first stance when it comes to the distribution of vaccines, with those countries who have taken or who have the capacity to develop and manufacture them taking the initial shares. To wrap up our discussion, I'll give you my thoughts towards directly answering the question this discussion was based on. Are we post-globalization? Based on what I see in the news headlines, current events, etc., I would say no. And yes. Right? Going back to how we define globalization, which is an increased degree of globalism, I would say from an economic perspective, there will be a continued trend towards an increase in economic globalism. Globalization. From a cultural perspective, I say that genie will never ever go back in the bottle. The way and speed in which we can travel, communicate, and share thoughts and ideas will never go back to the way it used to be 15, 20 years ago. The world will never be large again. Bottom line, still trending towards an increased degree of cultural globalism or globalization. And then finally, from the political perspective, that's a different story. The trend towards a degree of decreased globalism is there, or post-globalization. Western states have taken an increasingly nationalistic stance on many issues, but it remains to be seen if it is to an extreme degree or not. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something. I appreciate your time and patience. And of course, in the words of the great American pop culture icon, Porky Pig. That's all, folks.